Now listen carefully
and answer questions 31 to 40.
and answer questions 31 to 40.
Hi, today we're going to be
Hi, today we're going to be
looking at animals in
looking at animals in
urban environments.
environments.
And I'm going to be telling you
And I'm going to be telling you
about some research
about some research
on how they're affected by
on how they're affected by
these environments.
these environments.
Now, in evolutionary terms,
Now, in evolutionary terms,
urban environments
urban environments
present huge upheavals,
represent huge upheavals,
the sorts of massive changes
the sorts of massive changes
that usually happen over millions
that usually happen over millions of
of years. And
years.
used to think that
And we used to think that only
species could adapt
a few species could adapt
to this new environment.
to this new environment.
One species, which is
One species, which is
well known as
well known as
being highly adaptable,
being highly adaptable
is the crow.
is the crow.
And there have been various studies
And there have been various studies
about how they manage to learn
about how they manage to learn
skills.
new skills.
Another successful species is
Another successful species
pigeon,
is the pigeon
because they're able to perch on
because they are able to perch on
ledges on the walls of
ledges on the walls
city buildings,
of city buildings,
just like they once perched up
just like they once perched
on cliffs by the sea.
on cliffs by the sea.
But in fact, we're now finding
But in fact, we're now finding
early immigrants
that these early immigrants
just the start of a
were just start were just the start of a more
general movement of animals
general movement of animals
into cities
into cities
and of adaptation by these
and of adaptation by these
animals to city life.
animals city to life
And one thing that
animals to city life. And one thing that researchers
researchers are finding
are finding especially
especially interesting
interesting
which they're doing.
is the speed with which they're doing this.
Talking about gradual
We're not talking about gradual
evolution here.
evolution here.
These animals are changing
These animals are changing
fast.
fast.
Let me tell you about some of the
Let me tell you about some of studies
studies that have been carried out in this
that have been carried out in this
area.
area.
So, in the University of Minnesota,
So, in the University of Minnesota,
a biologist called Emily Snell
a biologist called Emily Snell,
and her colleague
Ruth, and her colleagues
looked at specimens of urbanized
looked at specimens of urbanized small
mammals, such
mammals such
as mice and gophers,
as mice and gophers
that had been collected in
that had been collected
Minnesota
in Minnesota
that are now kept in museums
and that are now kept in museums
there.
there.
And she looked at specimens that had been
And she looked at specimens that had been
collected over the last
collected over the last
100 years,
100 years,
which is a very short time
which is a very short time
in evolutionary terms.
in evolutionary terms.
And she found that during that time,
And she found that during that time,
these small mammals had experienced
these small mammals had experienced
a jump in brain size
a jump in brain size
when compared to ruminants.
when compared to rural mammals.
We can't be sure this means they're
Now we can't be sure this means they're more
intelligent, but
intelligent, but
since the sizes
since the sizes
of other parts of the body
of other parts of the body
change, it does
didn't change, it does
suggest that something
suggest that something
cognitive is going on.
cognitive was going on.
And Snellroot thinks that this change
And Snellrood thinks that this change
might reflect the cognitive
might reflect the cognitive
demands of adjusting
demands of adjusting
to city life,
to city life,
having to look in different places to find food,
having to look in different places to find food,
for example,
for example,
and coping with a whole new
and coping with a whole new
set of dangers.
set of dangers.
Then over in Germany, at the
Then over in Germany,
Max Planck Institute,
at the Max Planck Institute,
there's another biologist
there's another biologist
just called Katerina Miranda
called Katerina Miranda
who's done some experiments with black
who's done with some experiments with blackbirds
birds living in urban and
living in urban and
areas.
rural areas.
And she's been looking not
And she's been looking not
their anatomy,
at their anatomy,
but at their behavior.
but at their behavior.
So, as you might expect,
So, as you might expect,
she's found that the
she's found that
urban blackbirds
the urban blackbirds
tend to be quite bold.
tend to be quite bold.
They're prepared to face up to
They're prepared to face up to
a lot of threats that would
a lot of threats that would frighten
frighten away their country
away their country
counterparts.
counterparts.
There's one type of situation
But there's one type of situation
that does seem to frighten the
that does seem to frighten
urban blackbirds,
the urban blackbirds,
and that's anything,
and that's anything
anything they haven't
new, anything they haven't
experienced before.
experienced before.
And if you think about it,
And if you think about it,
that's quite sensible for a bird
that's quite sensible for a bird
living in the city.
living in the city.
Jonathan Atwell in Indiana
Jonathan Atwell in Indiana University
University is looking at how a range of animals
is looking at how a range of animals
respond to urban environments.
respond to urban environment.
He's found that when they're under stress,
He's found that when they're under stress,
their endocrine systems
their endocrine systems react
react by reducing the amount of
by reducing the amount of
hormones such as
hormones such as
corticosterone
corticosterone
into their blood.
onto their blood.
It's a sensible seeming adaptation. A rat that gets
It's a sensible seeming adaptation. A rat that gets scared
scared every time a subway
every time a subway
train rolls past
train rolls past
won't be very successful.
won't be very successful.
There's just one more study I'd like to mention,
There's just one more study I'd like to mention,
which is by Sarah
which is by Sarah
Parton and her
Parton
team.
and her team.
And they've been looking at how
And they've been looking at how squirrels
communicate in an urban
communicate an urban environment,
and they found that a
and they found
routine part of their
that a routine part of their
communication is
communication is
carried out by waving their
carried out by waving their tails.
tails. You do also see this in the country,
You do also see this in the country,
but it's much more prevalent
but it's much more prevalent
in cities,
in cities,
possibly because it's effective
possibly because it's effective
in a noisy environment.
in a noisy environment.
So, what are the long-term implications of this?
So, what are the long-term implications of this?
One possibility is that we may
One possibility that we may see
see completely new species
completely new species
developing in cities.
developing in cities.
But on the other hand, it's
But on the other hand,
possible that not all
it's possible that not all
these adaptations
of these adaptations
will be permanent.
will be permanent.
Once the animals got accustomed to
Once the animals got accustomed to
its new environment,
its new environment,
they no longer need the feature
it may no longer need the features
it's developed.
it's developed.
So now we have